Hello, everyone. Welcome to Or This. This is my Monday morning quarterbacking of the scriptures and the sermon for the previous Sunday, and this video is for Sunday, February 1st. The scriptures that are assigned for this day were Micah chapter 6, verses 1 through 8, Psalm 15, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 18 through 31, and Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. So, really great scriptures this past weekend, and I chose to dabble a little bit with Micah and then with the gospel. We had Scout Sunday, and so I really didn't tie in anything with the Scouts into the sermon, although the Scouts being a wonderful service organization who teaches kids leadership and service in their communities. That's certainly a good organization, good people to have this reminder about caring for the least among us, which is basically what it all boiled down to when my sermon came to a close. That's the simplified version. But anyway, so we had two scriptures covered in one sermon, and you can't always get to the real meat of anything when you do that. And especially with these two passages, which each could probably be a sermon in and of themselves. But I wanted to talk to you about two things in connection to the gospel. So Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 12 is the Beatitudes. And this is not only the opening of the Sermon on the Mount, which is this great body of teaching of Jesus that occurs in Matthew's gospel, but it also serves a bit as a mission statement for what Jesus' ministry is going to be all about. Sorry, phones are ringing. I'm going to let it ring and keep going with the video. So, mission statement for Jesus' ministry, because chapter 5 is end of chapter 4, beginning chapter 5 is where it kind of launches, where Jesus' ministry launches. And so these Beatitudes are sort of a mission vision statement for what it is they will be seeing throughout Jesus' ministry, and specifically as told in Matthew's gospel. So one thing about the Beatitudes, there was a time when the Beatitudes were taught as a way of almost an aspirational teaching, as though Jesus was saying, if you want to be blessed, this is what you should aspire to. Poor in spirit. Not that you would aspire to mourning, but, meek. Some of these other, that one, you can kind of see why that wouldn't necessarily work with that. But as though there was some explanation for each of these Beatitudes that this is, if you want to be blessed, then this is how you will live. But over time, I think further exploration into the Beatitudes and connecting them with Matthew's gospel in general has led us to realize that this is a statement about the location of God, which Jesus is going to show throughout his ministry. But this is a statement about the location of God, particularly amongst those who are suffering the most in those days, and also amongst those who look to alleviate the suffering of others and care for others. The merciful, the pure in heart, peacemakers in particular are mentioned in the Beatitudes. And so this is a statement of Jesus of saying this is where God can be found. And then throughout his ministry, Jesus exemplifies God's presence with these people and in these different ways. So, and it suddenly for me makes more sense that that the Beatitudes would be this and not something that Jesus wants followers to aspire to. Well, at least not unless you're talking about being merciful and peacemakers and pure in heart. That would be something that Jesus would be calling his followers to. The first four, as I said, are just a naming of the fact that amongst these people who seem to have a really hard time, who really seem to be struggling, yet yes, God, they are blessed with God's presence, and God is there with them. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. Then the second thing is, we've always had to be good, learn to be good biblical scholars when we see the Bible quoted in other places. It's great that the Bible can appear in various places out in the world, and it's not just for church anymore. So that's wonderful. However, then at that point, we need to be discerning about how the Bible is being used and whether or not that jives with what our understanding is of how that is truly appears, especially when one particular verse of scripture is pulled out of its context. And we've run into examples of this a number of times in the past, and I've mentioned some of those cases. Well, back in January, there was a case in which the Department of Homeland Security released a video in which they had footage, I believe, because I think this was it was coinciding with the action that they did in Venezuela. So this video was released, and it was showing footage of the military with their helicopters and rappelling out of the helicopter, and all in full gear with their machine guns or whatever gun it was. And you could see the night vision goggle view of military down on a roof, and just different military kind of clips of them completing a mission. But with that video, they put the passage, the verse, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God." And that made me cringe. And part of the problem with that, it's definitely taken out of its context. Think about that correlation, that association after what we talked about with the Beatitudes. And maybe we need to understand better the situation in which Jesus is talking. I talk often about the fact that the ruling powers at the time was Rome. And I've talked before about what Rome considered peace was not necessarily truly peace. Rome had a way of trying to keep people from getting riled up, but they did it basically through oppressive means. And they did that because they were powerful. They were the occupiers, and they used their military to keep people from having any agency or any resources to be able to really come out from underneath their power and their thumb. And this wasn't just hard on like the people who were poor. It was also hard on common people just trying to do their jobs. Fishermen, carpenters. There was always a tax that had to be paid to Rome, and it could be very oppressive, especially depending on how well, people in those days, they didn't have the same kind of trades that we have today. And so fishermen depended on how good of a day they had fishing, how much they caught. And yet they would still have to pay, pay Rome what was due. And so life was really hard for the common people because of the Roman Empire, who didn't really care about the life of the people. So Jesus comes along and starts caring about the life of the common people and the poor. He calls fishermen to follow him, and then he has this teaching. And so it's important to understand who Jesus is mostly talking to when he's saying these things. So when Jesus is saying, blessed are the peacemakers, he's talking to the common people, his disciples. And basically what I've talked about peacemaking in in recent past is it's about trying to bring peace into the lives of those who are struggling and have no peace because all they can do is constantly struggle to get what they need to live. And so the idea of being a peacemaker is helping your fellow man, your fellow human being, your fellow, human family, whatever, to be able to have what they need. And so the one of the problems with this video that was put out and associating with blessed are the peacemakers is you're associating peacemaking with violence and force and like a very powerful country, and saying that what they're doing is bringing peace, but they're using force to do that and have the power to do so. Whereas when Jesus is talking about being a peacemaker, he's talking to people who don't have power and he's not encouraging force at all. He's encouraging caring for your fellow human being and being committed to their lives. It's those of you who heard my sermon on Sunday, the idea of being committed to the well-being of those who are poor in spirit, those who mourn, those who are meek, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, and being committed to their lives. And it doesn't mean you have any power or any power to do big things, but it's just that ability to care for the other fellow human being. And so it's a very different feel for that one verse in the whole of the Beatitudes, set into the whole of the gospel, that is completely, to use that verse in that video was completely taken out of context. And so I encourage you to pay attention to those things when you see verses of scripture out in the world. And sometimes they are used in appropriate ways and sometimes they're used out of context. But it's important to understand what the scriptures are saying before in order to know whether or not scripture is being used appropriately or not in the world around us. So that's what I have for you. My video went a little bit long, probably longer than my sermon yesterday, but hopefully you got something out of it. And if not, feel free to share your thoughts either in the comments on YouTube or on Facebook. And I appreciate you watching. Thank you, and have a blessed week.